Okay, so here we are. We are going to be talking about the Ruby language. Why is this here? It's so annoying. So why are we learning two languages? I'm sure most of you have confusion. Like, we've been dealing with JavaScript and now we're jumping into Ruby. Why do y'all think we're doing that?
Versatility and having a large portfolio of options.
Right, having a large portfolio. Any other thoughts?
Ruby's probably better at doing certain things.
Yeah, it also gives you a really good perspective of like what we can do with various languages, right? Like knowing only one tool, not knowing there might be other tools that can have like different offsets in terms of what can I do with this language versus that language. You know, what's going to be the best tool for me to get the job done, right? You have more languages to choose from. You have more of an understanding of where the strengths and weaknesses are of any language. You'll be able to make better decisions, and you're more employable in that you're getting towards a path of being able to understand different concepts for how people are implementing things with languages, and you have more of an array of opportunities. If a certain company has like a particular stack that they're working with, and then another company has like a Ruby stack, right? You have the capability of applying to both of those things, okay? All that being said, you're most likely not going to end up working in the first language that you learn. So even though we're learning Ruby and JavaScript at this point, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to end up with a job working in Ruby or JavaScript. I know some of you had mentioned you know Java, or you've dabbled with Python. So those might also be languages that you would have access to, you know, utilizing in your jobs, and even going through understanding these languages better, you're already kind of like shoring up your understanding of what those other languages can do just by understanding the differences in each of those languages, or the similarities, right? We have larger frameworks and patterns that could be applied in any of those languages, right? So
in regards to Ruby and its relationship with other languages, I'm not totally familiar with this, but like my understanding is that most languages are object-oriented, like Ruby is an object-oriented.
So Ruby is object-oriented, and so is JavaScript. We do have functional languages, and there are functional features that exist in each of those languages. So there are larger concepts that you will understand as you're going through this learning of Ruby, and with JavaScript that you'll be able to apply in other languages, but not all languages are object-oriented. Java is object-oriented. I believe C# is not, but don't quote me on that. But there are things that you would learn either with object-oriented kind of like understanding and concepts that you can still apply with functional languages, and vice versa. There's like functional concepts, algorithmic understanding, the way that we're going to be learning all of these more in-depth subjects within these languages can be applied in other ways. And you'll be able to see how these languages compare and the pieces that you can kind of take in other places. Does that answer your question for the most part? Okay. You know, as we're learning new things, you know, we might feel like there's a little bit of, you know, fear in getting into things that you're just like, I really don't know how this is going to work, right? So by battling this on two fronts with two different languages, we're able to kind of alleviate a lot of that fear and be like, you know what, I don't know this, but I'm learning it in all these different ways. I'll be able to have a better understanding of what's actually happening. And not just the one way to do a thing in one language, right? We're not going to end up being stuck in that kind of mindset. So what you'll see mostly right now, and we'll kind of go over, is that we have a lot of the same concepts because these are both object-oriented languages. They're just really a differentiation when it comes to syntax. And you'll see that as we go through this process, these slides. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Ruby and the differentiations that it brings to the dev world. Okay, so one thing to note, Ruby is not Ruby on Rails. Ruby on Rails is a framework that is built on top of Ruby, and it utilizes a lot of different languages even within that larger framework. But Ruby itself is the programming language. Rails is the framework that utilizes Ruby as a language to build a larger ecosystem of tools that help you build an entire web application. Does that help? How does everybody feel about that? Pretty good? Okay. Okay, so now you know I'm learning Ruby, and I'm using that to implement things in Ruby on Rails, okay? Ruby is pretty simple in terms of other languages. It has a really good syntax, and Rails utilizes that to kind of implement the larger framework. It's an open source web application, so if we were on GitHub and we searched for Rails, we'd be able to see all of the source code for that framework. It's pretty huge and pretty amazing. Okay. As I mentioned, it's a framework that lets you build web applications. It utilizes databases like Postgres and SQLite 3 that we had downloaded to our computers. Okay. It's a framework that has a very particular way of doing things. One of their mantras is convention over configuration. So it really focuses on this is the best practice to do a certain set of things, and we expect that you're going to utilize it in that way. Obviously, there are ways to further configure Rails to do things that are really particular, but based on everyone's contributions and everyone's utilization of Rails, they've really come to have a way of discussing what you would say like best practices or conventional ways of doing something, okay? What it allows you to do then is to focus more on what the app actually needs to do and not how to configure the thing to make it happen, okay? So Ruby in particular is a language that was created by Yukihiro Matsumoto. It's the person pictured here. And their focus was really trying to make a language that was human readable, simple to understand, very elegant, but also really powerful. Okay, it feels a lot like English when you're writing it out, which can become a really useful thing when you're trying to build larger concepts for how something should work and the relationship between those things that you're building and other things. Okay, and again, it's an object-oriented language. Everything in Ruby is an object. Okay, question?
Are all languages
I don't know the answer to that. I've been curious about that as well, but I've found that just about any language that I've looked at online or utilized have all been written in English.
So like Chinese developers are learning this jargon and just kind of...
I would assume so, but we can totally, you know, do a deep dive or a spike one day and figure that out. But for now, yeah, I know that there are developers that I know from Mexico, for example, that are writing all this stuff in English. I know that sometimes they'll write like a function name in Spanish and they have their comments in Spanish. So a lot of the human readable kinds of things that need to happen are going to end up in Spanish. But a lot of the work that you're doing, at least with the language, a lot of the like the core module names and the ways that things are set up, they're set up in English. So yeah. Let's get into so some of the stuff that's not really English, but is universal, like arithmetic, we see here. So let me make this a little bigger. Ooh. Okay, so we have operators that we're utilizing for Ruby. I feel like it might be very similar to you in terms of your understanding of JavaScript. But we have the, you know, addition, subtraction, we already know that, right? Multiplication, exponent is, you know, 2 of those characters. Then we have division and modulo, just the same, okay, as we had in JavaScript. In terms of variables, as we know, variables are storing values, and we're assigning those values to the variables utilizing the equal operator, okay? The differentiation that I want you to make sure that you have an understanding of is that in JavaScript, you're typically going to say var variable name equals something, right? Or let variable name when we get into ES6, right? So in JS, we have, and we're in Ruby, so comments are not // right? They are hashtag. JS, we have let Kara equal Kara, right? Whereas in Ruby, we have the variable name just being defined. We don't need to indicate that we are defining a particular variable with a particular scope of what's going on. Okay, so we would just say Kara equals Kara at that point. Okay. The differentiation between when we're writing something, so let's say this would be Kara's name, right, equal Kara, whereas in Ruby we'd have Kara's underscore name. Okay, so Ruby is using underscore or what's called snake case, okay, whereas JavaScript is using camel case to do just about any kind of naming. It's the naming convention. Okay, thoughts, questions about that so far? So we have camel case, which is just capitalizing that in the middle, creating little humps, right? Whereas
Always wondered that. Totally unrelated.
here,
Because a camel has the big head.
oh yeah, I guess that would make sense. But the reason why they would do camel case as opposed to capital case would be where every word is capitalized, right? So thinking about camels, like camels have humps, right? Like don't think about their head. Maybe their head's like drinking water or something, okay? But the idea is that a camel has humps in the middle, right? So all the things in the middle are capitalized. Whereas the snake case is just like the body is being continuously strewn out, like as it's slithering across our screens, okay? And again, please make sure you're not like catching yourself up doing like dash instead of underscore. It really needs to be underscore. Even in Ruby, you can see that that might cause an issue in terms of like the coloration. So it'll let you know, okay? All right, so in terms of defining methods, we kind of talked about this. Ruby is case sensitive. That is something important to know as well. And then the last one, there are variables that might start with a $, or and there are also ones that will start, okay, fine. There are ones that may start sometime with an underscore before it. And all of those things have particular meaning. We'll get more into that as we get through a better understanding of Ruby's particular usage. But keep that in mind, okay? You're going to be utilizing mostly like words and underscore, or like letter characters and underscore when you make variables. You're not going to be using numbers, at least in themselves, to create variable names. Okay? All right. So with data types, we have a lot of the same kind of utilization with strings. Strings is a data type that we have in Ruby, just as we have with JavaScript. We're going to be utilizing single or double quotes. And in terms of if we ever get to a point where we need to do string interpolations, anybody know what interpolation means? Anybody tell me what interpolation is? Right, so if I say I am, you know, whatever, this, not this, what is it, this? Yeah. Is it? With Ruby?
You need to have to be double quotes on the outside.
Oh. There we go. I was like, where is this where is my coloration going on? I forgot we're writing a string, so we need the quotes, right? Okay, so we have the quotes. Interpolation means that I am, instead of explicitly writing the age that I am interpolating this with a value that is going to be replaced with this variable's value when I define that value in my code.
And is there preference as far as singular double quotes, or is that institution to institution, programmer to programmer?
This is a good question. There are reasons why you would use single quotes versus double quotes. A lot of it has to do with other characters that exist in that string that you may need to utilize. Sometimes when you want to not escape particular characters or use multi-line strings, single quote and double quote come into play. But off the top of my head, I can't remember the particular rules. Okay.
Single quotes, it's just a string. It's not double interpolation whatsoever.
Right. So single quote is going to give you, like, just really utilize that for only text character
And that's
type.
just like a heads up, like,
Hey,
hey,
it makes no difference to the machine. They're using it. So it's mostly for other developers. So if you have single quotes, then the developer knows, oh, this is just a string. When I see double quotes, why I'm having to like only use singles if you're going that's your gonna. When I see doubles, I automatically expect you to do.
Okay. And then as we get into JavaScript, we know that we can also use backticks, which is going to allow us to do a few extra things in JavaScript. But Ruby, we don't have to deal with backticks. Okay. So, so in this case, John would have said, I need this to be single quote, right? Oh no, we're interpolating, so it's double. Success. Okay. So we have our strings as single quotes here. Hello world, hello world. Empty strings can just be represented by open and close quotes. Okay, we just talked about interpolation. So we're defining this variable here. Jonathan would be replaced in this case. Okay, so numbers. We have numbers in Ruby that include both integers and floats. And a float is a decimal number, okay? They work differently and they are utilized in somewhat different ways, so keep that in mind. For the most part, using whole numbers is the way to go, because floats can sometimes work in surprising ways that we might assume when we're dealing with floats.
Just basic arithmetic. In both languages.
Well, I guess it depends on your interpretation of like basic arithmetic. Like you can add, for example, yeah, so you can add like 4.3 and 4.8, but your ability to like multiply and divide that and utilize modulus, for example, it might do some unexpected work that you would do normally as a human writing that out. So I would keep that in mind. This becomes much more of a problem when you're dealing with things like money or dealing with things that need a very specific type of calculation. So it's best to really just focus on utilizing integers, whole numbers, and you'll see how that works as you play that out as we're going through the program. Okay?
In some certain cases, it might end up being, I'm not exactly sure what the cases are, but the opposite could also happen, where you add two types of numbers together and it becomes a whole number.
Yeah, there's just a lot of unexpected behavior that you might assume, given like your understanding of math, that could come up as a really big problem in your programming. Like, why is this number turning into 0 now? Because it's, because it's like default float, being reduced to something, or it's turning into an integer, which is going to affect the way that your understanding of the calculation should work. So another way to mess with that kind of stuff is, you can always get into IRB in your command line and deal with that kind of testing. So IRB is going to take forever to load. Oh, so it's like 2.3 plus 4, 2, 4 plus. Okay, so for now, right. So far, so good. But as I said, a lot of unexpected things tend to happen and do happen when you deal with floats. So just keep that in mind. The next data type that we're dealing with in Ruby are Booleans, which we know is pretty much the same in JavaScript, right? We have true and false. Truthy and falsy are a bit different in terms, it's not necessarily like the Boolean data type, but that as a concept exists. Okay. We already talked a little bit about comments, utilizing pound signs, and that will help you with one line of comment code. And then this is for humans to read, right? It's not for the computer to read, so the interpolator or the interpreter for Ruby will ignore that code. And it's very useful to have comments, so don't feel like having comments in your code is a bad thing. Obviously, when you refactor, your code should be expressive enough that somebody should understand what is going on, that you don't need to write step-by-step what's happening. But if you have any kind of further context that might be important for somebody to understand how this code might work, or why it was implemented in the way it was, or some kind of edge cases that might need to be considered, that's the kind of comments you would want to leave in good, clean code. Okay. The useful thing here is an example that you're saying, like, this is the expected result out of this code function that we're building, right? Okay, so I kind of spoke to this a little bit yesterday. We have, so a lot of us in JavaScript, we were utilizing console.log, right, when we were trying to see what was going on in our console or in our command line. And then similarly, when we're in the browser, we have things that are returned to us because we are utilizing what is called a REPL, right? In the console on a browser, it already has that functionality. Whereas in the command line, we don't have the same exact capability when we're running a Node program, right? Unless we're actually in Node running a program. So returning a value, you're not necessarily going to see that returned value unless you do console log. In a similar way, if we needed to print out something to our command line or to whatever console we're utilizing, we would be using one of these three kind of functions, and that's going to print to our console what's going on in our program. Okay, so this is very similar to console.log. It's like basically creating like a log. Okay, so print is going to take whatever you give it and print it to the screen. So if you do print hello, okay, that's going to do whatever it needs to on the screen. Puts is going to actually put string. So it's similar, but it's going to add a blank line. And it's basically put string. So sometimes if you're like puts a number, it'll look different than printing the number. Okay, or if you want to print a method or some kind of other object information, it's going to look a little different when you utilize print or puts. Okay, and then gets is getting a value from the user, and that's in a similar function of utilizing prompt in JavaScript.
saying gets or get?
Gets. So some of you might see, or you might have seen in the past, gets.chomp. And gets.chomp is basically saying whatever I'm getting from the user, chomp off any of the extra content that is that may have been sent with the message, like new line string type information. Okay, so if we said puts hello, print hello. Okay. There's also p hello. Okay. Let's just do this real quick. If we do all three, let's for hello one. Okay, so if we're here, I need my terminal. Please and thank you. Okay. Okay. So okay. So if I Ruby RB. Okay. So we just did. Okay, so you see here the difference. We have puts hello 1, which puts hello 1, and then we puts 3, okay, and that's on a new line. Print hello 2 is just literally printing hello 2 and not a new line or any of that. So we have 2-4 here. So I was like, I didn't do 24, right? It's because it put 4 directly after that print.
Sure. Could you make that the bottom screen here so I can see?
Sure. Okay, so
okay, let's see.
Yeah, so that's not setting a new line, right? And then p hello 3 is literally putting out exactly what was written, utilizing the quotes and everything. Okay.
When you don't put the whole part, will it still print out as a string?
It might say, I don't know what hello is. Yep.
Oh, wow.
Said, I don't know what that is. So I can't interpret it. Okay, which is great. Ruby's errors are pretty awesome. So it's saying here, hey, in the Ruby file on line 5, there's an undefined local variable or method, because it could be also a method that was defined, right? Named hello for main. And again, Ruby, everything is an object. So there is an object, there's like a main object. So it's like, there's no other structure of like inheritance in terms of like classes and blah, 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 blah. We'll get into that. But as I interpreted this as its entire object, there's stuff in here that, in particularly in line 5, that I don't know about. So you need to tell me what that is.
Is the main object like a library that defines what variables are, what numbers are, is that why it's returning main object? That's something.
It's kind of like core. It's like core Ruby.
Okay, I see.
So it's like Ruby as like the main, like master object. Okay. So those are the differentiations that you get between print, puts, and p, which you'll be able to like play with as we get into some of the challenges. Okay. Gets is getting a value. So if I wanted to say, you know, what's your name? And then I would say name is gets. It would be able to, like, it would basically prompt you for your name. It would. Yeah, and the same thing here. Put S, get S. S stands for string in these cases.
Okay, so then whatever you get back from the user is
Would be,
response.
yeah, it would be defined as a response. Okay, so that's kind of how that works. Okay. Okay, the last one we have is, well, maybe not the last, but we have logical operators that are very similar to JavaScript. There's one difference you'll notice here. It's what I mentioned yesterday. We don't have this triple equal that's going on in JavaScript that we do not have in Ruby. Okay. Okay, so in the case that A equals 4 and B equals 2 here, if we compare, so this the compare operator, it would say that's false. Where not, instead of saying like not something, we would use not equal, right? So A is not equal to B. We have greater than or equal to, less than or equal to, very similar. We also have a method here where it's very similar to the three equals in JavaScript, where we're checking for both whether the value and the data type is the same. So remember in JavaScript, we had the three equals, meaning that it's going to type check on both sides if the data types are the same, and it's also going to check if the value is the same. Okay, if it's two equals in JavaScript, it's going to have what's called coercion. It's going to say, hey, can I make this into the same data type? And then at that point, can I check if it's about the same value? In Ruby, that does not happen. You can utilize that third type checking by utilizing .equal, which is a method. Okay, and another thing to keep in mind, in JavaScript, we're building functions. In Ruby, we're building methods. Okay, Ruby methods and JavaScript functions we're talking about the same things. Okay.
The double equals.
Mm-hmm.
So if we did 1 equal 1.0, float would come back true.
Let's find out. Okay, so we said 1 equals 1 point whatever. It is not.
No, 1.0.
Oh, 1 equals 1.0. True. 1 false.
Okay. I'm sorry, I'm not trying. So dot equals question mark is taking that first argument and then the argument in parentheses and seeing if they're the same.
Mm-hmm.
Why does this say false then? On the example.
Here?
Yeah, one.
So we just said that in here, 1 is an integer, 1.0 is a float. Okay, so we can say 1.class integer, 1.0 dot 1.0 dot class float. Okay, so if we did 1 dot equal, if I can type, it's false because it's type checking. So not only is it checking the value of those two objects, it's also checking if those objects are the same data type. So that's very similar to JavaScript's is 1 equal 1.0. In JavaScript, it would say no. Right?
And then the double equals must have some methodology.
Double equals is coercion. So it's basically saying like, I'm not gonna check precisely if y'all are the same object, but can I call you both and can you end up doing the same thing? Yes.
But it does that in Ruby with like a string versus a number, but not with an integer versus a float.
Right, whereas in JavaScript, if I did this, it would coerce, it would say, right. If this was a number and this was a string, it would say, hey, string, do you mind being a number real quick so I can check against you, the other one? And then they'd be like, sure, I could change. Okay, so that's what's happening on the back end, or like in the meat of all this stuff. Okay, and again, you can play with all this stuff. It's really useful to utilize IRB to be like, okay, what do I think is going to happen? Let me test that out, and then see what are some edge cases that might like make me have some different results.
Okay, I'm sorry, I may have missed this. So if you did the dot equals question mark, you did the same thing for like words and variables and like all that stuff.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
we just talked about that stuff.
So dot equal is going to allow, that's a method you can use on just about any object
Yeah.
to compare against another object. So you can use that for just about any data type. Okay? And again, it's checking both value and data type. Okay? So both what you think the value is and like, is this thing an actual same type of thing that the other one is? Cool. Okay, so we talked a little bit about functions being methods. So functions, JavaScript, Ruby, methods. JavaScript, how do we write a function? How would I write a function in JavaScript? Right? That's pretty much how that looks. Okay. Now, if we wanted to do Ruby, okay. Okay, so differences here. We have, okay, so what we're missing, block, right? But inside, anything tabbed inside of between def and end, that is what is thought of as a block. You're not seeing this, you don't need that block syntax here. Semicolons do not, are not needed in Ruby, okay? In terms of, you know, setting any statements. You're not gonna put a semicolon at any of these points. So you start with def, that's saying I'm defining a variable, okay, and then, or defining a method, sorry about that. And then when I wanna utilize that, or I wanna invoke that method, I would just use method name. In this case, we use arg, right? But if this method did not have a argument, I would just invoke it by using the method name, okay? The difference in JavaScript is that when we had, okay, when we had this and we wanted to invoke this function, we would have to use name like that. That's saying I'm invoking this function. Okay, whether or not it had an argument. So if this did not exist, that would look like that, right? And then we would call it like that. That does not exist in Ruby. So if this method, I don't need an argument, I don't need to put parentheses, okay? In addition to that, if I don't, like I don't need to explicitly put the block syntax in here, right? JavaScript would require me to have this, and it would basically look like that, right? Where end would end up being like this semicolon, but you don't need that in Ruby. It's just def and end.
Everything that happens within every type of action function within that function method, so method within that method, they all end.
Mm-hmm. So then if I have an if,
so that's basically taking the place of blocks to track location.
yeah, end is all, yeah. All the starts have an end and they're all nested. Okay.
Do you want to pass variable to a non argument? Still pass it, right? Are you get it through like another variable? No, like arguments that say arguments, right? Like in JavaScript you can pass more.
So if I put name equals Carrell, and I did this like say my name like this, you're saying like in here you would be able to say let's hello, my name is name like that.
Well, like, I mean, there's, like, I recall there being like an argument that stores, object that stores. At least I know that exists in JavaScript.
I'm not really clear on what you're asking, but there are ways to pass variables inside and outside of larger methods. And
Saying you would pass it as a parameter if you have no argument function definition.
yeah,
I mean,
I think that kind of process will get more clear as we get more detailed into like more complex way to build various methods and like scope. So that will become more clear when we start talking about scope. Okay. It's I think you can.
like in JavaScript, I remember you pass, if you have two arguments, you pass like 5 arguments. You'll get access to them. Like, what's the
Oh yeah, again, we talk about that later, but that is assuming that you want to take any given amount of arguments. This method will not take arguments. So if I tried to say my name and then put parentheses, like if I tried to run this method, say my name and then put like Kara, John up in here, it would say this method does not take arguments. Okay, it would say like you gave us 2 when I expected 0, so you need to figure that out. If in here I defined that I can take any given amount of arguments, okay. Okay, I don't know what's going to happen honestly, but we can run it. Okay. Huh? Name is Xer. So if I say that, right? Actually, let's see what happens if I put John too. It'll probably say like John does not exist. Oh, good point.
So like coercing them to an array or something like that? Or you can call them by mix.
Okay, so
I think I call name variable.
huh? We have this here that's calling, it's invoking the method.
Cares undefined. In the actual
Because I named it name. It's star?
It's star name.
Thank you for that. Okay. Okay, so it's saying that name, did you mean names? So on Ruby line 3 in say my name, there's an undefined or local variable method name. So we'll say names. Because here we said that there was a variable named name, right? Outside of the method. We'll see what happens.
We didn't make name outside the function.
Yeah.
Global or whatever.
No, that's not
Something else?
that wouldn't be what we would use here. We wouldn't need to make that a global variable. So in the case here, we have given amount of names, right? Because we're passing 2 variables, or because we're passing 2 items, okay, it's taking name, but this variable in here it's saying like I'm bringing in both names, so it's not going to only take name here because that's defined outside of the variable or outside of the method. So if we have name here, let's see what happens. Let's make this easier. Yeah. Okay. It's an array because you're taking any given amount of arguments. So because you don't know how many arguments you're getting, it's saying that, oh, I'm going to take a collection of items. I don't know how many items those might be, but that's how that works. It's a lot more advanced than we need to be getting into right now, but that's how that might work. Thanks a lot, advanced. Okay, one other thing that I want to make sure that we all have an understanding of is when we deal with if, else, and else if, all that kind of stuff. Normally when we had JavaScript, we had if, condition, right? Then do a thing, right? And then else, if, condition, do a thing, okay? Now in Ruby, we just need to say if condition, okay. Okay, so now we don't have parentheses around this parameter of the condition, right? We don't have parentheses to say if this condition exists. We just do that here. And then anything nested inside of that if statement happens, and then we end. So no blocks, no parentheses, okay? So if we needed to do if condition, else, other condition, okay. So ElsIf is actually ElsIf like that. And then if you're using ElsIf, you need to have a default condition. That's else, okay? So if, do something, else if, do something else, do another thing, end, okay? Okay, that's how if and else if works, right? In JavaScript, we have else if. And so the good thing, if you have some highlighter stuff, it might be like, whoa, that's not how we talk about this in Ruby. And it's else if, okay? Okay, I don't think we need to get into while loops, but in a similar fashion, while condition is true, do something. Similar thing, we have an until in Ruby. So until this condition is met, do a thing, okay? So we'll execute until a condition is true, whereas while is doing it while the condition is true. So when it becomes false, it will stop. Whereas this one, until, like if it's false, until the condition becomes true, right? So until we get to step number 5, do this thing, okay? Now, in both of these cases, we need to make sure that we have break so that we don't end up in an infinite loop situation, right? If nothing is ever changing this condition, until and while are going to either, it's going to never work or work until your computer breaks, okay? We get into collections later, so I'm going to let you ask any other questions for the next 4 minutes, and then we'll take a break, and then we'll get into what y'all are doing today. Any thoughts or questions, slides that you want to go back to? Thoughts about Ruby? It's not making you happy, Ruby? I know, Matt is lying to us by not making you happy. But soon, when you use this, when you use this, right, it's designed to make programs happy. So maybe there will be some kind of, you know, like bell curve of your happiness along with your utilization of Ruby. Believe me, I feel like I love JavaScript, and especially as we're like developing it further, but Ruby was the first like language I got to, well, no, JavaScript was the first language I got to play with, but Ruby is really useful. It's easy to read. I don't have to deal with semicolons and block things. It's really, those are like some of the most annoying things ever.
Can you use like Ruby and JavaScript for the same thing? Oh, yeah.
You're going to be using JavaScript when you build something that happens on the web. Just case in point. Ruby is a language that you can utilize with JavaScript in that you would be able to have some interface program that will like communicate what you're doing in Ruby and then be able to like pass on information to JavaScript and back and forth. So that's largely how a lot of things are built, right? We have React and Ruby on Rails on the back end. For example, we have React on the front end and we have Ruby on Rails on the back end. Or we are utilizing Ruby with some of the programming that we do, and then that gets exported out into a format that JavaScript can read. So these languages are going to communicate with each other as we build our knowledge. So yeah.
That's something that the framework does, is that it makes the transition to JavaScript seamless. That's something that you have to consider. I guess probably both.
Yeah, I think this will become more clear as we work on things. But yeah, Ruby will help us with communicating, saving information, data that we want to pass along to parts of our program. And then there are formats that both JavaScript and Ruby know that we would be able to pass that information across utilizing those kinds of formats like JSON, for example. Okay? But for now, you just need to understand how to deal with the syntax, which will be pleasantly different than JavaScript, I feel. Okay? So I'm going to stop the recording now.